Vamos para mais uma comparação aqui do Switch 2, rapaziada. Dessa vez a gente vai dar uma olhada aqui no Hogwarts Legacy, uma comparação aqui que foi feita pela Digital Foundry. Vou estar deixando o link na descrição pra vocês irem lá, deixar o crítico no like. Mas de qualquer forma, os caras chegaram aqui a fazer uma comparação de duas versões. A primeira com a versão do Series S e depois com a versão do PS4. E aí, na verdade, tem uma terceira, que é uma comparação com o Switch 1, para meio que ver o quanto que o jogo evoluiu, né? Mas eu acho que agora vai dar pra gente ver aonde que o Switch 2 ele tá se situado. Deixar que ele chega a ser uma versão da próxima geração um pouquinho mais capadinha, que é no caso do Series S, ou ele tá mais perto da geração passada do PS4 e do Xbox One. Porque, na verdade, né, o Hogwarts Legacy é um jogo excelente pra isso, porque ele foi feito muitas coisas pra poder trocar de uma geração pra outra, principalmente na questão do Switch. Mas bem, vamos lá dar uma olhada então, ó. A gente chegou aqui a começar aqui a comparação do Series S. Vamos nessa.
I think we need to explain what it isn't first. And just for context, we have about 2.5 minutes of footage between a creator's voice segment that Nintendo published a couple weeks ago, and they also published an additional roughly a minute of Switch 1 versus Switch 2 footage, direct lineups from Nintendo.
Essa comparação ficou meio
which is also
esquisita,
very
né?
helpful here. In comparing the
Nem
Series
trouxe
S
ela
here,
aqui
I'm
no canal
using
pra
Series
vocês.
S in fidelity mode because unfortunately the performance mode is bugged at the moment. It has very inconsistent animation between frames. It's the same issue that we saw in the Series S version
Nossa,
of Ghost Runner
nossa,
and the
estranho
High
mesmo.
on Life release on the Xbox Series machines.
Sabia que no Series
But
S
the
era
two
assim, não?
Series S modes are pretty similar outside of resolution, so yeah, I just did not want to introduce that one bit of inconsistency there.
Pô, inclusive, rapaziada, Switch 2 chegando aí em menos de 2 semanas, eu vou trazer algumas comparações, as minhas análises pra vocês. Eu comparo no modo performance ou no modo qualidade dos videogames? Porque é uma coisa que eu vou estar comparando. Existe um jogo que vai estar, por exemplo, o Final Fantasy VII, né? Ele é 30 FPS no Switch 2, pelo visto, não tem um modo 60 FPS, pelo visto. E aí, eu comparo com o modo qualidade do PlayStation? Como é que eu faço, né? Essas coisas assim.
Because it does look quite
Não
horrible,
abaixo
I
no
would
comentário.
say.
Eu acho justo, né? Tipo, ainda mais se for contra o Series S, tá o modo qualidade contra, né? 30 FPS contra 30 FPS.
The Series S performance mode, I'm not sure for how long it's been broken there, but yeah, it's not so great. So Hogwarts Legacy is kind of an unusual game
Deixa
and
eu
maybe
botar no
kind of
meio
an
aqui.
old school game in that a lot of the core assets and world design are totally different between its various incarnations. Like you said, famously the Switch 1 at its worst end, and something like a PlayStation 5 or Series X at the top end there, or certainly the PC version. And I think we see some of that when we compare
Switch 1,
Series S
o
to
Switch 1 foi
Switch 2
muito
here.
diferente o jogo, né?
So we're seeing a lot of asset differences between Series S and Switch. So I think a good area to view this in is the Hogwarts Common Room, the Gryffindor Common Room rather. If we look here, for instance, there's a table in the corner. It's a squared off dark brown table, right? If you can see there in that zoom in.
Tá.
On Series S, it's a lighter circular table,
Bem lá no
presumably
fundo,
with
né?
a lot more geometry.
Mas é outra
Even though
mesa
we
mesmo.
see that the table only occupies a very small amount of screen space there, you can see that the tables are different tables, and that is indeed one of the key asset differences we see across the various versions of Hogwarts Legacy, is that there are these asset differences where they've actually gone out. It's not just a worse slot, it's not just a less detailed version of what
outro
they had
modelo.
otherwise. It's actually a completely different model that is sort of trying
E
to
tem isso no jogo todo,
get
né?
a bit of a different compromise in terms of the polygonal budget of the item versus its perceived graphical fidelity, right, for a weaker platform. So that's kind of interesting. When you look at the fire here, there's a big shadow of the grate on Series S. On Switch 2, not so much, it seems. The fire also looks a bit more voluminous. And the rug on the floor is a simple flat texture on Switch 2 here, but on Series S it has some humps and it isn't laid totally against the ground flat there. In this shot of the Gryffindor Common Room as well, you can see that all the rugs on Switch 2 use different assets from their Series S counterparts. If you look towards especially the bottom left of the screen and bottom middle of the screen, you should be able to see there that those are different assets. And then if we move over to the shot in the teaching building, if you look at the stone columns on the left-hand side of the picture here, Switch 2 has less geometry on those columns and has lower resolution textures, which is a fairly obvious difference. Moving over to this shot in Ollivander's, which is like the wand shop in Hogsmeade, the globe above the main character is missing on Switch 2. And it's present on the Series S fidelity mode there. Yeah. And in this shot, you can notice how the stones are blended into the dirt with maybe a more elegant layering of materials in Series S, whereas in Switch 2, they do jut out a bit. There are also some things that aren't necessarily asset related, but do seem kind of like they're stemming from, in general, a different settings preset maybe than the Series S is using. Because like if you look at the shadow maps in this shot, on Series S, the shadow maps appear to update every frame for this environmental shadow. but on Switch 2 it occurs somewhat less often.
Aham, dá
It
pra
looks a
ver,
little
tipo,
bit
é
odd,
um
but
sim e
it
um não,
does
pelo
help
visto.
to minimize
frame sim,
shadow
frame
map
não.
aliasing a little bit there because that
A
less
sombra, de como ela mexe.
persistent update between frames. It's not causing so many jaggies there in
Mhm.
motion. And there's also a bit of a lowered shadow resolution, nothing crazy, but a little bit of a lower shadow resolution. But
Aham.
there are a lot of shots here that I could go through where they do look pretty similar. I think that's especially the case if you're looking at some of these more broad overview type shots, like if you're not looking up close at certain assets, the
Ali
differences
parece que a
don't
grade
stand
tá
out
até
as
um pouco mais
much.
destacada
But
no
I
Switch
think in
2,
the
né?
limited number of
Mas
shots we
também tem
do
uma
have
luz
where we
aparecendo
are
mais.
able
Ah lá,
to
agora tá mais parecido.
analyze some detail up close, we do see some of those differences, which is kind of like, again, where you tend to see that split in the various versions of Hogwarts Legacy. It's really in the up close detail, especially between current gen and last gen consoles.
Mhm.
But moving on to those last gen consoles, I actually thought that the Switch 2 version reminded me quite a bit of the PlayStation 4 incarnation of the game. So if
Aham.
we go back to
É,
Gryffindor
parece que estão
Common
usando os
on
mesmos
PS4,
assets, né, da geração
all the
passada.
divergences we saw between Series S and Switch 2 are basically gone. You know, the rugs and the carpet are the same between PS4 and Switch 2.
Aham.
There's no really defined shadow cast by the
Ah
grate
lá, ah lá.
in front of the fire there. The
Right.
table in the corner, the same squared off table, right? In both
Mesma
versions.
mesa
It's the
esquisita.
same kind of
Esquisita não,
squared
só
off
diferente.
table there. It looks really, really similar. In the wand shop, the globe is missing in both versions. And in the opening sequence, the ground textures look very similar there.
Ah,
Most
então
of the
tá aí,
shadow maps
rapaziada. Eles
appear at a
provavelmente
pretty
usaram a
similar
versão da
resolution, and
geração
they also
passada pra dar
update
um,
at a bit of a staggered rate there. They're not updating
uma
on
versão
every
aqui pro Switch 2.
refresh. But there are some differences, like in that odd little shot in the teaching building. If you look at the stone pillar on the left, in this shot, it actually does appear high resolution on PlayStation 4
Ué.
for some reason, which is a little bit of an odd change, but
Estranho.
you know, a little bit anomalous here for sure. And in this shot, there's a little bit of more texture detail in the Switch 2 in the upper left-hand corner of this wall here, which is certainly something that is a little bit more indicative of a Series S setting in this.
Aqui, né?
instance. So
Essa,
there's
essa
some
textura aqui, ó.
differences there between the various versions.
Yeah.
I think the key area of interest in this trailer is this shot in the trailer, for me at least, which is of these two walkways at Hogwarts. So if you look at the walkways here, there's one that's kind of a blue walkway with blue stained glass, and there's another
Right.
walkway with green stained glass beneath it.
Aham.
And then obviously the position of the character is another third walkway, which has no obstruction to it, right, in the Switch 2 footage.
Got it.
Now, if we if we replicate this shot on PS4, it's actually impossible to replicate because the walkway
Eles
that
botaram uma
is
paredaça
present
no PS4.
on Switch that's an open walkway is actually totally blocked off on PS4. And if I push the camera outside this area with the photo mode, you can see that the walkways on PS4 have that same obstruction, have the same stained
Right.
glass they do on Switch 2, but it's actually, you have this additional obstruction where you can't even see them on PS4. So that is a high level of a kind of occlusion there. But
É, tipo assim, eles devem ter colocado coisa assim, né? Obviamente, pra economizar um pouco na performance, né? Não ter um ambiente muito aberto, não carregar muitas coisas ali na memória. Mas é interessante ver como que tem passagens que são fechadas no PS4, que não são fechadas no Switch, mas tem áreas que são fechadas nos dois, né? Que eu acho que não é na geração seguinte, mas eu não me lembro dessas passarelas fechadas aqui.
if I bring
A nova
back
geração.
the
Ah lá,
Series
ah lá.
S for a moment, you
Realmente.
can actually replicate the Switch 2 shot, except that the
Caraca,
two
o
walk
Switch 2 não... Cara, será que o Switch 2 realmente não conseguia deixar essa passarela aberta igual ao do Series S, mano? Ele tem bastante memória, o Switch 2. Inclusive, ele tem mais memória do que o Series S. Eu imagino... E olha só, não tá com esse prédio aqui no fundo, né? Essa construção aqui. Ela não aparece aqui no Switch 2 também. Ela só deve aparecer quando, sei lá, você vir pra essa passarela de cá e aí você consegue ver. Quer dizer, não porque tá fechada, né? Mas, teoricamente. Mas que esquisito, cara. Tá.
walkways are totally open. You can see into them, and you should be able to see out of them, and you can also see a structure behind them. Like I think it's the Great Hall behind them. On Switch 2, I guess they presume you're just not going to notice that structure is omitted, even though you could be able to see it on Switch 2, even with the coverings there. So this is a really, really key optimization that was made for the last gen console versions and also Switch, where they block off more of the level in these open shots to minimize streaming.
Nossa, isso aí é broxante
keep
demais,
less
né? Um
assets
lugar todo
resident in
fechadão,
RAM.
mano.
Here,
pra
the
você ver o
Switch 2
rio,
seems to be somewhere in the
o
middle
lago.
between these two platforms, with 2/3 the walkways blocked off on Switch 2, as opposed to the PlayStation 4, where they're blocking off all the walkways, and on Series S, where they're blocking off none of the walkways. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little detail there. So overall, I mean, I think that the game on Switch 2 seems a lot closer to the PS4 release in terms of the kinds of asset compromises they've made in general, but it's not a straight port of the PS4 settings. There's some stuff that matches Series S a little bit more, and I could see the developers maybe taking that PS4 approach as a base and then upgrading it maybe selectively to take advantage of the Switch 2. Obviously, that the fact that walkway is uncovered seems like a fairly intentional choice. It does not seem like something that would have just done incidentally. It seems like kind of a recognition that maybe the system can actually pull off a little bit more streaming in that moment, and they can actually get those assets resident in RAM in the way that they couldn't on the PlayStation 4, perhaps.
Cara, eu acho que foi isso, mano. Eu acho que eles pegaram a versão de PS4 ou de Xbox One, portaram pro Switch 2 e falaram assim, o que a gente pode usar a mais? E foram colocando coisas a mais. Curioso, porque eu acharia mais interessante pegar a versão do Series S e às vezes trabalhar com ela pra baixo. Porque questão de memória, por exemplo, né? Não é uma coisa que... Memória, processador... É bem melhor do que a do PS4, por exemplo, eu acho, né?
So that's one... I think that's my general takeaway here. But there's one important thing to note that I'm not quite sure what to make of as well, which is that the Switch 2 version is only 24 gigabytes in size, according to the Switch eShop listing. Well, the PS4 is like, I think, 55 gigabytes.
A do PS4 é 55
so it's possible there's a lot of
GB.
asset duplication there. It's also possible that the Switch 2 version might have some different compression settings and things like this. But that is an odd change,
Caraca.
I would say. And then and then as one kind of final note here, you know, regardless of whatever platform you're comparing the Switch 2 to, I think it's very clear that it looks a lot better than the Switch 1 version.
Right.
And,
yes, that was going to be my question about that, because obviously that was like the lowest rung on the ladder, so to speak.
Do Switch 2 era complicado.
Yeah. So it looks a lot better than Switch 1, I would say. Nintendo actually put together some Switch 1 versus Switch 2 assets, which I think they're generally representative of the differences. But I don't think that the capture is totally representative of the way that the Switch 1 version
a cor tá meio esquisita, né?
Because if you look at a comparison between Nintendo's Switch 1 capture and our Switch 1 capture here, you can see that Nintendo's Switch 1 capture looks oddly a little bit washed out. In my own capture, I think it looks fine, and it measures up, you know, comparably to the other versions in terms of contrast, in terms of saturation, in terms of those elements. So that is a little bit of an odd note here. But even using Nintendo's assets, you know, I think you can see here that the image quality, the performance, the lighting quality, everything's been greatly improved relative to Switch 1. When you go back to that Switch 1 version, there were so many changes that were made for that version of the game. So many changes even to just like the structure of the environment, to the environmental geometry everywhere in the open world. There were so many new loading screens that were introduced. It was a different game, visually different game structurally. It looked like it was on a completely different generation of console hardware. And performance didn't measure up that well either. So I think here what we're seeing is a game that looks like pretty confidently like Hogwarts Legacy, and obviously much, much better than that Switch 1 version of the game, which is certainly very encouraging to see because I was not a huge fan of that Switch 1 version, I have to say.
Right, yeah. I mean, I'm kind of curious about this. I mean, on the face of it, it's exactly what you'd expect, right? A version of the game that sits between the last gen and the current gen versions to a certain extent. It's going to be interesting to see when we have a lot more footage to look at, when we actually have hands-on experience of the game, just what kind of balance they've gone for here. But what I'm really interested in, and what I find is actually really to the credit of the developer, is that they could have just cut down the original version of the game. They could have savagely cut it back. But, you know, the fact that they went in and actually created new assets that are actually, you know, more complementary to the performance level of the last gen systems, I think is a
o trabalho que eles tiveram ali para poder refazer.
And I think, you know,
são duas versões diferentes do jogo, né?
Essentially got two sets of assets that they can draw upon for the new version of the game for Switch 2. Possibly opens up some interesting possibilities for them. And I'm going to be interested to see how it all pans out. Now, I did play the game, or rather, Tom played the game, actually, thinking about it at the London event. And I did watch him play it, and it looked okay. Obviously, it didn't quite have the same sort of degree of splendor as the game running on a PC or PS5 Series X. But, you know, I think it did the job based on what I saw. I think the thing that concerned me a bit was when there was complex geometry. There were performance drops, so that hopefully was a work in progress version of the game. We just have to wait and see what the final version looks like.
Esse negócio de
And
tá
that
no
was
teste realmente
actually
a versão de
running DOT. We
meses
didn't actually
atrás.
get to see the handheld version of the game. All of which leads us on to disclosures that have come about since that event and since the original Direct.
Rapaziada, daqui pra
which
frente,
have some
eles
interesting...
falam aqui um pouco de umas coisas, né, de estar usando DLSS, de estar usando a resolução que tá aqui, coisa e tal, que é interessante. Mas, normalmente, se quiserem ver o vídeo completo, vou estar deixando aí na descrição pra você dar uma olhada aqui. Eles chegaram a comparar, que tipo assim, falou que tá usando DLSS, mas se a gente for botar um PC aqui na mesma qualidade com DLSS, a entrega do Switch 2 é diferente. Eu acho que o Switch 2 tem uma versão mais pocket do DLSS, né? Coisa que a gente já até chegou a ver em alguns... como é que chama? Trademark, esqueci o nome aqui que me dá certinho, né? As patentes, né? Uma parada um pouquinho mais pocket aqui pro Switch 2, então acredito que seja um DLSS menos eficiente do que a gente tem aqui no PC, né? E também ele chega a falar aqui sobre segmentação do mundo, né? Porque eles falaram que não vai ter mais loading screen, mas quando mostrou isso, mostrou em Hogsmeade. Mas também tem uma outra segmentação que é em Hogwarts. Então será que eles deixaram ali Hogwarts com uma loading screen, só tirou de Hogsmeade? A gente vai ter que esperar pra ver. De qualquer forma, achei interessante aqui essa comparação. O que bota pra gente aqui o Switch 2 ali entre a geração passada e o Series S, né? Tipo, então tá ali no meio termo assim. Eu acho que o que o Oliver falou é verdade. Tipo, eles pegaram a versão da geração passada e aí depois vai ver o que a gente pode ir a mais ali pro hardware do Switch 2. Em vez de fazer o contrário, pegar a versão do Series S e o que a gente precisa cortar para ir pro Switch 2. Enfim, de qualquer forma, não falta muito tempo pra gente botar as mãos nos jogos. Definitivamente é um jogo que eu vou querer conferir aqui e trazer algumas análises pra vocês. Mas deixa abaixo nos comentários, rapaziada. O que você achou aí da performance do Switch 2? Tá dentro do que você estava esperando ou não? Tá melhor ou pior? Deixa abaixo nos comentários. Claro, curtiu aqui o vídeo, pô, não esquece de deixar aquele clique no like, se inscreve no canal e segue a gente nas nossas redes sociais. Pode ser? Ficando por aqui. Valeu, um abraço, até mais e...